I'm not going to give a full formal introduction because you'll hear more about Adam's background in the church service. But I have to tell one story on him while people are streaming in. So he was assistant pastor or associate pastor or something at Hyattsville while we were there. And Judy was on the committee, the church committee. And so we were looking for like halftime, and Adam, or three-quarter, whatever it was. Adam was interested in this because he was going to use the rest of his time doing hymn text, which is what he does. And we thought the last thing we needed at Hyattsville at the time was more music. We had so much music. But anyway, it was such a good fit that we ended up calling Adam, and it turned out to be a great gift to the congregation. He brought not only music and new eyes on history of music and songs and understanding of texts and so on. He also drove some of his new texts with the congregation there, which was a lot of fun. But one of my memories, when he came for his candidacy I can't remember if it was at Adult Ed or at the church service when he preached his sermon, but he chose one of these texts, that's just so impossible to really come to grips with. And he did a great job of coming to grips with it. And it's kind of like, it's one of those things where, at the end, you're still saying, well, what do we do with this? And he said, well, if you call me, I'll help you work it out. That's Adam. He was, of course, the text editor of Voices Together. Did his undergrad at Goshen and did his theological work at AMBS. So we were so tickled to find out he was going to be the text editor. And we knew it would be good, and I'm happy to introduce him this morning.
Good morning. There's a handout going around. Hope we can make sure that gets to everybody. Mark left out perhaps the most important part of my biography, that I lived from age 8 to age 15 in Corvallis. And so being here feels like being at home for me. When we started planning this trip, getting to the West Coast again, I just felt this gut feeling of homecoming, and I've definitely experienced it this week. And it's been so good to be with Mark and Judy again these last few days. With apologies to those of you who were there yesterday in Portland, some of this will be repeat material for you, but we'll dive a little bit deeper than we were able to there. Looking at this document called Expansive and Inclusive Language in Worship. This is a document that when we first developed it, it was called Aspirations for Language Use. And what this really means is, how do we make decisions about what hymns we mess up? Which hymns are we going to change and really bother some people by doing so? And which hymns are we going to change and perhaps give new life to, perhaps revive for a new generation of singer? I sometimes felt, as the text editor of the hymnal, it was my job to decide who to make mad at any given time. But I've been grateful to discover that, yes, there are hymns that I definitely hear complaints about, but just as often somebody else has thanked me for what we've done to that particular hymn, because they're able to sing it now, and they hadn't been for a long time. So we're going to start off by looking over this document. Since you have it in hand, I'm not going to read every word of this, but I would encourage you to take a look through it. Part of what we realized is that we didn't want a rules-based approach to text editing. We didn't want a list of no-no words or things that we're always going to replace, or theological concepts that we were going to eliminate from our vocabulary, because our church was too big for that. Our denomination was too big for any single approach to work universally. And so we wanted, since we weren't going to have rules that say, we will never say Father, or we will never say blood, we needed ways to discuss when those things came up, to say, is it important here? if we use it here, maybe we can do something else here. How do we hold these things in tension rather than having one-for-one substitutions every time something came up? This is also important to me as a text writer, that we have an approach that would give us room to respect poetry, respect history of texts, in addition to respecting the theological diversity of our denomination. So this list, the worship resources editor, Sarah Johnson, and I developed on a car ride through the Allegheny Mountains of Pennsylvania, returning from the Laurelville Worship Leaders Retreat in Pennsylvania to Indiana. And this was coalesced out of our first several committee conversations as a whole group. So questions like, who is God? How is God represented in any given hymn? Are we using a wide range of biblical images? And in fact, if you turn on to the next page, this is copied right out of the Worship Leader Edition. And the article in the Worship Leader Edition that follows this is Scriptural Ways to Address God in Worship. And you can see just the first portion of that, Names for the Spirit. We have all of these biblical images for the Spirit, and it goes on with biblical images for Christ, biblical images of God the Creator, God the Father, God the Mother, for a good page and a half of just a diversity of images. If you go back to older hymnals, you might find 3 images predominating: God as King, God as Creator, God as Father. And there were a lot more options to draw upon scripturally than that. And if you look at the trajectory from, especially if you go back to like the 1927 hymnal through 1969 through 1992, that keeps expanding. We keep drawing upon more and more different material. As I mentioned, we wanted to represent the theological diversity of the denominations at Mennonite Church USA, Mennonite Church Canada. Age, how are different stages of life recognized and described in the words we use? Are we honoring children, respecting their autonomy, respecting their theological development? How are we honoring our elders in our use of words, in our judicious use of revision? The way I came most often to formulate how we approached revisions is thinking about the depth with which hymns can take a hold of us and the depth to which we can hold on to them. That these words form us, they shape our faith, they become part of our vocabulary, part of our theological imagination. And so it's important to me that somebody who has been singing a song their entire life recognize it, that it still be the thing that shaped their faith. But at the same time, I have a 12-year-old son, and I have to imagine, what language do I want him to have when he reaches that age? What language do I want to form his faith over the next generation and the next generation of the church? So how do we hold those two things in tension? The need to respect the lived memory of the church and the desire to shape the next generation of faith in the same way. And sometimes that meant leaving something alone that we might otherwise have changed, and sometimes it meant changing something even though it would be disturbing or difficult to swallow for some folks. We asked ourselves questions about race and ethnicity. Perhaps the most interesting one here is what to do with the word darkness. The word darkness can very easily be conflated with race, and in some rather nasty ways, thinking about what used to be termed the dark continent, which was both a racial and a spiritual designation for Africa in previous generations, and has just horribly racist, disturbing overtones to it. So when the word darkness is associated with sin and suffering and death, it is all too easily circled around to our understandings of race. Where a word like shadow means the same thing in the visual sense, but isn't as closely associated with racial designations for people. Class and economic status. Are people of all classes able to identify themselves within our music? when we sing of poverty and wealth, is the singer identified closely with one side of that equation and not the other? Is one side always being served and the other side serving, for example? Ability, how do we sing about things like blindness? Is it associated with sin? An example of something that theologically we might have changed, but because of history and memory we did not change, was I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. Theologically, I would love to change that, but Amazing Grace is one of the most widely shared ecumenical songs and is often sung in settings where people from many denominations are coming together for a memorial or things like that. And so to disrupt that it seemed like too big of a hill to climb. Gender and sexuality, these are perhaps the most debated, most discussed, and most familiar issues to think about, particularly when we think about gendered language for humanity. Largely, Hymnal Worship Book took care of this for us. We stand on their shoulders that we're not referring to all people as man or using one man as a stand-in for any particular person. And we've attempted to take the next couple of steps in terms of how we reference God in these terms, trying to expand our notions of God's expansive gender. One of the more recent, or more recent to us in terms of our linguistic understanding questions, is what to do with gender binary. It is no longer all-inclusive to say brothers and sisters, if it ever was. That there are genders between and outside of that binary that we wanted to be able to see themselves within the hymnal. So there are still some places where there are reference to men and women. We particularly paid attention to where those reference ministry, because there were many hymns written in the 80s and 90s affirming that men and women are called to God's service, because it was and still is in many places so difficult to recognize the ministry of women. So that's an instance where retaining that gender binary felt important, but there were other places, like in here in this place, here we were, your sons and your daughters. With Marty Hoggin's permission, we changed that to something else. How are we singing about other Christians? How are we singing with people of other religious traditions? One of the question marks that came up was a hymn that used the YHWH designation for God as a name for God within the hymn. And using that in an out loud way is sort of a no-no in Jewish traditions. And so that's something we avoided doing. Do our hymns perpetuate colonialism, nationalism? I would add to that monarchical ideas. And what is the relationship of humanity to the earth and to non-human creatures? Now, all of these things, you would be able to flip through the hymnal and say, but you didn't do that there. Or, and Chris is nodding because he raised one of those really good questions yesterday, because we sang a song that's all about God as king with he's and chariots and all this stuff in it. We didn't change everything we could change. And we probably changed some things we shouldn't change. And we tried to be judicious, we tried to be balanced, and we tried to make room so that a variety of different kinds of churches can find themselves in the hymnal. If every page of this hymnal worked for you personally, it would not be the right hymnal for our denomination. If every page in this hymnal worked for Albany Mennonite Church, it would not be the right hymnal in this denomination. You should be able to find things that bother you, maybe even offend you, things that you would never want to sing. It's not there for you. But maybe there's a church down the road that needs that song for whatever reason. And this goes for theological language, it goes for musical style, it goes for the language of the songs themselves. our hope was to both resource and reflect a denomination that is quite broad and quite diverse. And no single church needs to sing all 760 songs in the collection. But my hope is that Albany Mennonite Church would be able to find the 200 or 300 songs that an average church does go through over the course of a few years. And my hope is that you'll be able to find the songs that are deep in your memory, your heart songs, as well as new ones that will stretch you in some interesting ways. All right, enough of the talking part. Let's do a little bit of singing. Like I said, we didn't always change what we could change, and sometimes we put all of our chips on one song. When we recognized that a way the song was familiar was inhibiting its use for some people, we invested a little bit in trying to find a way to revive its use. One such example is This Is My Father's World, a favorite hymn for many people, but it uses what I might consider unnecessary patriarchal language. There's nothing in the hymn itself about God as Father other than the metaphor Father, which is not further developed in the rest of the text. The text is about the world as God's, as being created by God. So turn to number 180, 180. And you'll see what we did here. This is a revision that we borrowed from first the United Church of Canada 1995 hymnal, and it's appeared in a few other hymnals since then. This is God's Wondrous World. This refocuses the hymn from the beginning and has opened up its use to congregations that are less comfortable now singing Father. Let's sing a stanza of this. La, 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 la. This is God's wondrous world, and to thy listening ears, all nature sings and roundly rings the music of the spheres. This is God's wondrous world, thy rest in the thought of rocks and trees, of skies and seas, the wonders God has wrought. The other question mark we had to deal with was in the rustling grass, in the rustling grass, I hear him pass. And our practice was always to go back to earliest sources to see if there's anything that could inform our revisions or suggest new additions. And in Babcock's first publication of this, we found the stanza, "This is my Father's world, a wanderer I may roam, whate'er my lot, it matters not, my heart is still at home," which I found just lovely and theologically beautiful, poetically rich. So we brought that in stanza 2. Now, as I said, that's an instance where we felt a metaphor wasn't really central to the hymn. We were able to, we hope, revive use of this song for people who had set it aside for a while. But we did not always take out Father. There is still Father in the hymnal. And so if you turn to number 517, 517. This is another classic memorized piece, Children of the Heavenly Father, where Father is the theme, is metaphorically developed, and beyond that is developed in a way that expands quote-unquote traditional notions of fatherhood helpfully. Safely to his bosom gather, nestling bird, star in heaven, such a refuge never was given. God tends and nourish. This is an image of Father that we found helpful, poetically rich, and deeply ingrained. And notice across the page, these images of Father and Mother paired together in this nurturing faith section of the hymnal. Now, we also recognized that when we were introducing feminine language for God, first of all, of course, it has to be done very carefully and intentionally. But Sarah Johnson, our worship resources editor, pointed out to us during the process that where we were bringing in feminine language, we were exclusively using reproductive language. It was always God as mother or God as womb, and in those instances, sort of a disembodied womb, that it wasn't expanding beyond that to explore God's femininity. We didn't have any God as queen, for example. It was so easy to say God as king, but even now referring to God as queen is kind of a mind bender for me. Queen, yeah. So when Sarah pointed this out to us, we realized that there were a lot more ways we could imagine God using feminine pronouns and feminine language. If you would turn to number 44, after Sarah did this analysis, we commissioned the creation of a new text from hymn writer Jackie Jones, and we asked her to use all kinds of biblical images, whatever she wanted to draw upon, except for mother and womb. We asked her to explore images without relying on reproductive images. And so what she did, she went through, especially the Hebrew Testament, but a couple from the New Testament, and found all of these interesting places where God was given a role or an identity, such as potter or shepherd or knitter of sinews, that I think our imagination pictures the male shepherd with his crook, or a male potter for no good reason, or a male doctor knitting sinews. I don't know. We have been conditioned to see these as men for no good reason. And so all Jackie has done is put these images together and use feminine pronouns. So let's sing together, "We Long to Know Her." We'll just sing one stanza. Using a somewhat familiar shape note melody paired in hymnal worship book with brightest and best. So that was one of our efforts to expand these images of God, and I think this is gendered God language 201, but I'm going to take us to gendered God language 101 next. As you might guess, this is enough. This piece is enough to keep this hymnal out of the hands of many churches, which is unfortunate, because nobody's required to sing this, right? If this is not right for a congregation, it's perfectly fine to skip over it. But our wish is that even those congregations would be able to find themselves elsewhere in the hymn book, and if they occasionally flip past this one and are confronted by it, all the better. So pop quiz for you. In Luke, there are 3 parables about something that's lost. What things are lost? The coin, sheep, one more. coin, sheep, and son. That's right. So the prodigal son, as it's often called, the lost coin, the lost sheep. In the parable of the prodigal son, who's the God figure in the story? Father. In the parable of the lost sheep, the God figure is shepherd. And in the parable of the lost coin, the God figure is the woman. Yes. So that's why I call this Gendered God Language 101, because people get that, even if it feels a little strange to them. Turn to number 299. 299. We've had ways to sing God the Shepherd. We've had ways to sing God the Father. And this gives us the third parable in that trilogy. This was written by two members of our committee. Annalie Leptison wrote the tune. Katie Graber wrote the text. And in fact, there was... This was premiered at Laurelville a couple of years ago, and I remember the night before its premiere, about half the hymnal committee was crammed into one of the tiny little bedrooms in Laurelville's lodging, workshopping what to do with some of the syllable lineups. So, yeah. So that's just a little glimpse into what went into some of these decisions, and I hope it gives you a sense when you encounter something that seems strange. Why did they tweak that? I hope maybe you can go back to this expansive inclusive language document and say, oh, they must have been asking themselves about XYZ when they approached this one. I'd be happy to open it up to a little bit of conversation. Any questions that you have, not just about topic for today, but in general?
When you change words to a song, do you have to get their permission from the author?
Yeah, when it's a living writer or still under copyright, it requires permission. Well, it remains under copyright for a good while after that yet. So copyright law, frankly, is ridiculous. Things that I wrote as a 24-year-old that say I live to be 80, so it's hard, math is hard. The copyrights will extend 75 years after my death. So it's got the 60-some years from when I wrote it to my death, plus 75 years after that. That's too much. And they call this the Mickey Mouse law, because copyright keeps getting extended the older Mickey gets, to make sure that Mickey stays under copyright for Disney. It's a system in need of revision. But that means that when something is still under copyright, especially when something still has a living writer, it was important to us to get permission to, when possible, work with the creator of the piece to find an acceptable solution. And sometimes find out, no, they're not willing for us to make changes, and then we would determine, is this still so important that it will go in as is, or do we look for something new to fill that slot? I should add, too, that our review process for all of our songs was anonymized, so that the committee, when things received initial reviews that were high enough, the pieces would come to the committee, we would sing through them together and discuss merits and drawbacks and possible changes. And so, I've written, pushing 300 hymns now, and a lot of those came through this review process. And my colleagues didn't know when they were singing something I'd written, and then we're discussing merits, drawbacks, and possible changes, and I'm sitting there like, okay, yeah, I'll see what I can do with that. So a number of my pieces I did wind up revising out of that experience, just as I saw these pieces through other people's eyes and had them processed through these lenses. It wound up being very helpful for me.
I'd like to have more examples, but I was wondering, there are a number of instances in the new hymnal where the accompaniment is totally different than the pew edition, the songs on the pew. And the one I'm thinking of right now is Amazing Grace. And I kind of think I know why you did that, but there are others where what we sing in the congregation is totally different than the accompaniment that's in the book.
Yeah, there are a number of cases, like for example, Amazing Grace, it's perfectly fine to play that from the Pew edition as written. And if I recall correctly, what's in the accompaniment book presents different stylistic options. And those might often assume a unison congregation to be able to use a more embellished accompaniment, things like that. That's partly a way to recognize that there are not universal standard ways of interpreting every hymn, and we want to encourage exploration of different styles, encountering something like the Amazing Grace the way a church well-versed in Black gospel might sing it, for example. So it does require some attentiveness to what does the congregation have in hand compared to what I'm playing from the book. I think it should be fair to say that the melodies will always be fine, but yeah, you need to pay attention to whether the parts follow the same harmonization. Another one up front here.
How much did this cost?
The whole process, you mean? Initially, right. I think Menomedia, their initial scheme was to raise $606,000, and yeah, we rolled our eyes when, right. It was a better budget that way. I think I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but the final budget wound up being well north of that. But the sales far exceeded what Menomedia was expecting. The initial print run of 40-some thousand sold out, and we've been working on subsequent print runs. Part of the reason for that is Menomedia's projections of the population of the denomination were based on, okay, taking out the Church of the Brethren part of the market because this was just a Mennonite project, now looking at the population of Mennonite Church Canada and Mennonite Church USA, both of which have been in a decline for the past 30-some years. What they failed to take into account is that a church that was 300 people in 1992 and is now 80 people may still want 300 copies of the hymnal because they still have all these pews and they still have funerals and they still have weddings. So once you add that into the sales equation, things look a little bit rosier.
So this is really a picky thing, but so the fact is not that important to me. I'm just curious about the process in a committee like yours. Okay, so 706, so Healing River, I happen to know they had the author, Fred Hellerman, wrong in the last edition. So my question is, how does the committee go back and kind of realize that mistakes were made and then kind of have to get it right? I don't even know if you were.
Yeah, this was a catch that I made, and our practice was to look for earliest instances of every song that we could. And we have a lot more tools at our fingertips thanks to the internet than the 92 committee did. So the 92 committee experienced this as a folk song that was just in the air, as many were in those eras. And so it was just attributed, I think, as traditional in hymnal worship book. And I happened to see when I was looking at various sources of it, oh, there's actually an attribution. There are nameable people behind this that should be getting royalties. And so when we came across those things, we corrected whatever we could.
You may be too young to know. Do you know who Fred Hunterman was?
No.
He was in the Weavers.
Oh, okay.
The
Yeah.
Weavers of the folk group of with Pete Seeger back in,
Sure.
in the early 50s, the Caucus.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm glad we could give credit where credit is due. So.
Well, just to follow up, because now I'm curious, how? So does that mean that the song in the blue hymnal should have generated royalties and didn't? And
Yeah.
And what do we do with that?
Yeah, and that's sort of up to Menno Media to negotiate. I don't know how this particular instance was handled, other than the proper people got in contact. If I remember correctly, the response was, "Oh, I'm just glad people are still singing it." I don't know if there was a request for back royalties or not, but certainly would be deserved. Not very much on an individual basis, but when you multiply it by 40,000 copies, it adds up. Right. So a certain percentage of the price of one hymnal, and I think it's, if I remember right, it's 12% for this book. So 12% of the sales price is divided up among copyright holders. Which, I don't remember the percentage of pieces that are under copyright, but then that pool is divvied up per share, per copyright item, text, or tune, and then royalties are paid out based on that. I don't know, maybe we should sing something as a closing. Any requests? Any songs you want to sing to finish up Sunday school?
What is the initial hit here? What seems to be the most popular new one that's picked up that we didn't have before?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I'm not sure. We have a number that we've been sort of actively trying to get into people's repertoires, and those have been catching on well, and we have several of those sort of scheduled for the rest of the day today. Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know if we have data on particular choices that are really being well adopted. One of mine that we'll be singing during the service is "When Pain or Sorrow." And I've encountered a number of churches that have really adopted that already, which has been quite moving to me to see how that's caught on.
Because one of my new favorite songs, I said this might be a hard song. Next time we're exploring the hymnal, this 582. I love the colors outside the lines.
Sure.
582.
That's one where I would want to have is one of our pianists able to jump in on that? Because it's a little bit more of an adventure in the accompaniment book, I think.
We don't have to sing it
All
right
right.
now.
I think we might.
Record it, would that be helpful?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. I'm not gonna be good with the rhythm, so I'll support it though. It's the only skill I have.
And we'll just, yeah, if you give me that started.
My love comes outside the lines, exploring paths that we could never find.
Thank you. All right, any closing thoughts or take a little bit of a break before the worship service here? All right, thank you. And I'm happy to talk to you one-on-one if you want to know a little bit more about anything in particular.